Framing is a great way to add something to your photographs that others might have missed. It's where you place your main subject in a position within your photograph with accompanying elements partially or fully surrounding it. To make it a frame with purpose, it's good to find a relationship between the elements of the frame and the subject. But it can be a lot of fun to juxtapose two completely separate things that have no relationship to each other whatsoever. When you see a photographer doing this in itself is the rawest form of framing. For one, it helps you see part of a scene within a frame without even having to get your camera out. And second of all, it could make a frame itself, a little bit like the thumbnail of this video. In a lot of the places I go to take photographs, there are old abandoned buildings, which are great to frame a landscape in the distance through the old window frame. This gives you an idea of what views the people who lived there would have seen. Another way to frame a shot is to find some trees or branches and find a hole through which you can take a photograph, then place the subject in that hole. In this image, I shot at 50mm to get the trees and leaves to frame these old buildings, but not to encroach too much into the frame. Shooting wider does work, but then the tree trunks start to become more dominant in the frame. It can also create the illusion of depth, because that thing that you're shooting through adds another layer to your photograph. If you have your subject, the frame you're shooting through, and then the background, this will give you an extra layer to what you might have first seen. It almost gives the point of view from the photographer and what they were sat in when they were taking the photograph. You can also manipulate the brightness in your scene to frame that subject. Whenever I'm shooting in a wooded area, I'll always look for breaks in the canopy where the light might be breaking through. Then I'll expose properly for the brighter area and underexpose the surrounding trees. Another less obvious way to do this is to use a long zoom lens and zoom in on a setting sun that's surrounded by clouds. Now, if I'm doing this and I'm using a DSLR, I'll never use the optical viewfinder. I'll use the live view, and I'll normally do it when the sun is setting, so it's less powerful than in the middle of the day. If you do use an optical viewfinder, never look through that telephoto lens at the sun, because it might damage your eyes. When I am doing this, I'll expose for the sun, and that means that surrounding area will be really underexposed. And that really dark area frames that sun perfectly. I love doing this, and whenever there's a sunset or a sunrise, I'll try and grab one of these shots. Recently as well, there's been quite a few sunspots on the sun, and if you underexpose it enough, you can start to see those sunspots, especially if the sun is shining through a thin layer of cloud. You can also use partial framing. In this case, you can see I've shot through these two rocky outcrops to frame the mountains in the background. It kind of works, but I think I should have found two matching sides with these rocks. Now you can do the same with trees. In this shot, I saw a break in the wooded area I was standing in and shot the volcanoes in the distance with the Milky Way above it. Then there's shooting in a gorge. Here my wife is walking on ahead, and I love how the sides of the gorge are framing the hint of the waterfall in the distance. This is much more subtle way to use framing than the first example where I shot through that window. You can take this to another level by being more and more subtle. In this image, I used the reflection, giving this symmetry to mirror the shapes in the sky to frame the headland. When shooting buildings, try looking for frames within those man-made structures. In the Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, there are plenty of opportunities for this, like this one of frames within frames within frames. Then if you're patient and wait for the right people to walk through that frame, you can get a really compelling photograph. On the other hand, you can be really subtle and use parts of that framing, having it coming in and out of the sides of your photograph. Your imagination will build what I was surrounded by, even though it's not actually in the photograph itself. In this shot, when editing, I darkened the sky and the reflection to frame the cityscape and then used the bridge to frame the buildings. Also look for any caves that you can shoot through. This one in Havod leads you through to a waterfall. Like shooting through a window in a building, you can do the same with vehicles. This was when I was on an off-road expedition cutting across the empty quarter in the UAE. The window framed up the other vehicle dropping off the dunes. This was very much an opportunistic shot, but I think it works. Believe it or not, having a blurry background is another way to frame your subject. You're basically putting everything out of focus apart from your subject, hence framing the subject. Now, this is a little bit overdone with the likes of Instagram, but if you're a wedding photographer, you're probably used to using this technique. And people who aren't photographers absolutely love this, to the point where phone companies have started doing that fake blurry background look. When it first started, it was pretty rubbish, but it is getting better. So don't just think of frames as shooting through windows or a hole in a structure. Start to use contrast and brightness, as well as that blurry background to frame your subject. After all, this is what you're doing with frames. You're telling the viewer you know exactly what you're photographing, and you're giving them a hint as to what to focus on by drawing a shape around the main subject. Another way you can build frames into your photographs is by the use of colour, but you do need to understand colour theory to get to grips with this fully, and this is next week's subject. If you're watching this in the future, I'll link it here, and if not, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss out. I'll see you next time.